I had been planning the trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything. Work, city life, the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment window. I found a secluded camping spot deep in the national forest, far from any popular trails. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near a small river that I had found on an old map. It seemed perfect. No people, no noise, just the woods and me. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed a dirt road that eventually turned into an overgrown path. I parked my truck at the side and hiked the rest of the way in. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched under my boots as I pushed through thick brush, carrying my pack and gear. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to the river to hear the water, but far enough away that I wouldn't wake up soaked in morning mist. After getting a small fire going, I cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and beef jerky. The quiet was comforting. I had missed this feeling of being alone in nature, away from everything. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had camped alone before. I knew the noises of the forest. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I lay still, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for a small animal, but too light for a bear. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming the beam outside my tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I listened for a while longer, but the sound was gone. Probably just a deer, I told myself. I zipped my sleeping bag up tighter and forced myself to relax. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Maybe I had imagined it, half asleep in the middle of the night. I shook it off and spent the day hiking, exploring the area, collecting firewood. By sunset, I was tired but content. I made another fire, ate dinner, and sat by the flames, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I turned quickly, my flashlight cutting through the night. Still nothing. I stood up, scanning the tree line. My skin prickled. Someone was out there, watching. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and kept it close as I crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise had me wide awake, gripping the handle of my hatchet. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, I heard something that turned my blood cold. A deep, steady breathing, just outside my tent. I held my breath, my mind racing. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Whoever or whatever was out there stood just inches from the thin fabric separating us. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard slow footsteps retreating into the woods. I waited until the sun came up before unzipping my tent. My hands were shaking. I stepped outside and scanned the area. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into my pack, my heart still hammering. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked back to my truck, every snap of a twig making me jump. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe just some stranger messing with me. Maybe something worse. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. The idea was simple: spend a few nights deep in the wilderness, away from all the noise of the city. I packed everything I needed: a tent, food, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a survival knife. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I found the perfect spot on a map, a remote area near a lake, surrounded by dense forest. The plan was to hike about 10 miles into the woods, set up camp, and just enjoy the solitude. The first day was uneventful. I parked my truck at the trailhead and started hiking. The air was fresh, and the forest was thick. I followed a narrow trail that had probably not been used in months. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and occasionally, I heard the distant sound of running water. I walked for hours, stopping only to take sips of water and adjust my backpack. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near the lake. It was perfect, flat ground, enough space to set up my tent, and a great view of the water. I set up my tent quickly, then gathered firewood. As the sun dipped below the trees, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The night was calm, just the sounds of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. After eating, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, feeling at peace. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was completely silent. That was strange. The woods are never truly quiet at night. There's always something moving, an animal rustling through leaves or a breeze shifting the branches. But this was absolute silence. I listened for a while, heart pounding, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a cold breeze. The silence from the night before still bothered me, but I brushed it off. I made some coffee, ate a protein bar, and decided to explore the area. I walked along the edge of the lake, taking in the beauty of the place. The water was still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. Felt untouched, like no one had been here in years. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. They were deep, made by someone wearing boots, and they led from the woods to the edge of the water. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared near the shore. There were no return prints. It was as if whoever made them had walked into the lake and never come back out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the calm water. It didn't make sense. I shook off the unease and continued my day. Maybe it was an old camper. Maybe I had missed the return tracks. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at a distance. I stayed up late, listening. At around 2 a.m., I heard something. A single snap of a branch close. Too close. I turned my flashlight towards the sound, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I barely slept that night. Every little sound made me jolt awake. The first light, I decided to pack up and leave. As I stepped out of my tent, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt, leading up to my tent. Deep boot prints. Someone had been standing just outside while I was sleeping. My stomach turned. I grabbed my knife, packed everything in record time, and started hiking back. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear movement behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. I walked faster. The trail felt longer than before. My mind raced with thoughts. Who was out there? What did they want? I pushed forward, refusing to stop until I reached my truck. When I finally saw it, parked exactly where I had left it, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I tossed my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Just standing there, watching. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe a hermit, maybe someone with bad intentions. All I know is that I was not alone in those woods, and I never want to be that close to the unknown again. I have always loved camping, getting away from the noise of the city, breathing in the fresh air, and sitting by a fire under the stars has been something I've enjoyed since I was a kid. Over the years, I had gone on many solo trips, hiking deep into the wilderness and setting up camp in places where I wouldn't see another person for miles. There was something peaceful about being alone in nature, but that peace was shattered on a trip I took a few years ago. I had planned to camp in a remote area of a national forest, a place I had never been before. It was far from the usual campgrounds, and I had to drive for hours down winding dirt roads just to reach the trailhead. From there, it was a 6-mile hike through thick woods and across rocky terrain to the spot I had picked on the map. I had researched the area, checked the weather, and packed everything I needed for a few nights alone. My pack was heavy, but I was used to that. I was excited to get away from everything for a while. The hike in was uneventful. The trail was narrow and overgrown in some spots, but I made good time. I reached my campsite in the late afternoon, a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire, and the sound of running water in the background. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun dipped below the trees. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, just the usual rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Everything felt normal, but later that night something changed. I had been asleep for a few hours when I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I listened, holding my breath. The forest was silent, too silent. Anyone who has spent time in the woods knows that there's always some kind of noise, crickets, the wind, an occasional branch snapping. But in that moment, it was completely still. My skin prickled. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a soft sound barely there, a shuffling noise, like something moving through the underbrush near my tent. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. It wasn't an animal. Animals move with purpose, quick footsteps, a sudden rustle. This was different. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was creeping just beyond my sight. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, shining the beam outside the tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I held my breath, waiting, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination or a small animal passing by. I told myself that and forced myself to lie back down. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Everything seemed normal at first. My gear was where I had left it, the fire pit undisturbed. But then I noticed something strange. The ground around my tent had been disturbed. The dirt and leaves had been shifted, like someone or something had walked around my campsite while I slept. There were no clear footprints, just an odd pattern of movement. My stomach tightened. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had done it myself when I got up to use the bathroom during the night and just didn't remember. I pushed the thought away, made breakfast, and went about my day. I hiked around the area, took some photos, and explored a nearby ridge that overlooked the valley. It was beautiful, and for a while, I forgot about the strange feeling from the night before. That evening, I built a bigger fire than usual. It made me feel safer. As I sat by the flames, I kept glancing into the darkness, half expecting to see something watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees and the flickering shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I kept my knife close when I finally crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound was back, soft footsteps circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I held still, gripping my knife. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I could hear breathing, not the heavy huffing of a bear or the quick sniffs of a coyote. This was human. Slow, steady breaths just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I stayed as still as possible, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever was out there wasn't making any noise besides their breathing and those slow, careful steps. They weren't trying to scare me off. They were waiting, watching. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't dare move. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, listening for any sign that they might return. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the area. My fire had burned down to embers. The forest was quiet again. I checked the ground and saw more of those strange disturbances in the dirt. Someone had been there, and they had been standing just inches from my tent. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. I didn't want to be there another night. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But I never saw anything. I reached my car, threw my gear in the back, and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. Maybe it was some hunter who got too close. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Or maybe it was someone who had been living out there, watching, waiting for people like me to wander in alone. I still go camping, but I never go that deep into the wilderness alone anymore. Some places are better left unexplored. I had been planning the solo camping trip for months. Work had been stressful, and I needed to get away from everything for a while. Just me, the woods, and the sound of nothing. I picked a spot deep in the forest, away from the popular trails where families and casual hikers went. I wanted real isolation, the kind where you don't see another person for days. I checked the weather forecast, packed enough supplies for a week, and made sure to let my brother know where I'd be. If anything went wrong, at least one person would know where to look for me. The drive to the forest was long, but I enjoyed the time alone. The last stretch of the trip was on an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became. Tree branches scraped against the sides of my truck, and potholes shook the whole vehicle. Eventually, I reached the spot I had marked on my map, a clearing near a slow-moving river. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. I spent the first day setting up camp. I pitched my tent close to the tree line for extra cover and set up a fire pit a few feet away. I collected enough firewood to last a couple of nights, filtered some water from the river, and made myself a simple meal. The sun set behind the trees, and soon, I was left with nothing but the glow of my fire and the sound of the river. It felt good to be away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just nature. That first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of rustling outside my tent, but it was probably just a raccoon or some other small animal. In the morning, I took a short hike to explore the area. I found old signs of human activity, remains of an old fire pit, a rusted tin can, and what looked like the collapsed remains of a small wooden structure. Maybe an old hunter's shack. It had been there for decades, covered in moss and almost completely hidden by the forest. The second night, things felt different. As I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet the woods had become. No crickets, no owls, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound you make. My breathing, the crackling of the fire, the occasional pop of burning wood, it all felt louder. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something out in the trees, a faint, deliberate sound. Not an animal moving through the underbrush, but something stepping carefully, trying to stay quiet. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but all I saw were shadows. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself to go to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made my heart pound. I must have drifted off eventually, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized my fire was out. I was sure I had put enough wood on it before going to bed, but now it was nothing but smoldering embers. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, careful. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. I reached for the knife I always kept with me, gripping it tightly. I stayed completely still, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, just when I thought whoever was out there had left, I heard something worse. The slow, deliberate sound of a zipper being pulled. My tent's zipper. I shot up, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it straight at the door of my tent. Nothing. The zipper was untouched, exactly as I had left it. But I knew what I had heard. I sat there, my heart pounding, gripping my knife so hard my hand ached. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up camp. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was out there. As I loaded my gear into my truck, I looked around one last time, and then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints circling my campsite. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone had been out there watching me. I got into my truck and drove out of there as fast as the rough road would allow. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out to stretch my legs, still shaken by what had happened. As I stood there, trying to calm myself, I noticed something on the side of my truck. A single, deep scratch running along the driver's side door. I don't know who was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I had planned the trip for months. A solo camping trip deep in the national forest, away from crowded campsites and noisy tourists. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I had checked the weather, packed everything I needed, and mapped out the route. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway from the stress of work and city life. The first day went exactly as I had hoped. I parked my truck at a trailhead about 20 miles from the nearest paved road, shouldered my pack, and started the hike. The forest was dense, full of towering pines and thick underbrush. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through the hills. Birds called overhead, and every now and then, I'd see a rabbit or a deer dart through the trees. After about 6 miles of hiking, I found a clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, plenty of firewood, and the sound of running water nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat back, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the quiet of the woods. The first night was peaceful. I slept well, only waking up once when I heard something rustling outside the tent. Probably just a raccoon or a deer passing through. I wasn't worried. The next morning, I boiled some water for coffee and cooked a quick breakfast. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled like pine and damp earth. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream for a while and climbing a small ridge to get a better view of the valley. Everything was perfect, but that evening things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, finishing my dinner, when I got the strange sense that I wasn't alone. That feeling you get when someone is watching you. I glanced around, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I kept looking over my shoulder. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside made me tense up. The wind moving through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just animals. That's what forests sound like at night. But something felt wrong. Sometime around midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. These were slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath, listening. The steps were coming from the trees just beyond my camp. I reached for my flashlight and shined it in that direction, but there was nothing. Just trees. The footsteps had stopped the second I turned on the light. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. I half expected to find footprints, but there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get the best of me. I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to stay another night. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. That sensation of being watched never went away. That night, I made sure my fire was big and bright. I ate my dinner quickly, scanning the darkness around me. As I was getting ready to crawl into my tent, I heard something, a whistle. A low, sharp whistle, coming from deep in the trees. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was human. I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. Then, from a different direction, another whistle. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing. But I knew what I had heard. And whoever it was, they weren't making noise by accident. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my knife in my hand, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear something moving in the woods. Not an animal, something bigger. I kept the fire going as long as I could, but eventually, I ran out of wood. As the fire died down, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife tighter, my breath shallow, then silence. I sat there in the dark, my nerves on edge, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, and the forest slowly came alive with the sounds of birds and insects. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt different. Every little sound made me jump. I kept checking behind me, convinced I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in the back and locked the doors. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I never found out who was out there that night. I never saw them, but I know they were there, and they were watching me. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months. Work had been draining me, and I needed a break from the constant emails, deadlines, and artificial lights that made every day feel the same. A solo camping trip seemed like the perfect way to reset. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. No notifications, no obligations, no distractions. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campgrounds. I wanted isolation. I wanted to be somewhere that felt untouched. A few online forums mentioned the area. People talked about its beauty, its remoteness, but also its difficulty. The trails were unmarked, and the terrain could be unforgiving if you weren't careful. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it spent on winding roads that turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. By the time I reached the closest point my truck could go, it was late afternoon. I loaded my backpack with supplies, double-checked my gear, and locked up the truck. From there, I had a few miles to hike before reaching my chosen campsite. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in some spots, but I had done my research and marked my route with GPS coordinates. The air was crisp, cooler than I had expected, but I welcomed it. My pack was heavy, but my legs felt strong. The trees towered above me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The sound of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. It was peaceful. As I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of solitude settled in. No distant hum of traffic, no human voices, just nature. Every so often, I would stop and listen. The absence of man-made noise was something I had missed. I pressed on, following the faint path until I reached a small clearing by a stream just as the sun was starting to set. It was perfect. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and made dinner. The warmth of the flames felt good as the temperature dropped. I ate slowly, watching the sky darken, stars appearing one by one. The forest at night was a different world. Sounds carried differently, shadows moved in ways that played tricks on the eyes. After cleaning up, I sat by the fire for a while, just enjoying the quiet. There was no fear, no unease, just a deep sense of contentment. I checked my GPS once more, noting my exact location, then crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and exhaustion from the hike settled in quickly. Within minutes, I was asleep. I woke up to a sound, a snap, like a branch breaking. My eyes opened immediately, my body tense. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. The sound had been close. I held my breath, waiting. A few seconds passed, then another noise. This time it was softer, more deliberate. Footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I had hiked miles off trail. No one else should be this deep in the woods. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle as I listened. The footsteps were slow, measured. Not an animal. A deer would move differently. A bear would be louder. This was something or someone moving carefully. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The fabric of the tent was thin, offering no real protection. If whoever was out there wanted to get in, they could. Minutes passed. Silence. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. My muscles ached from staying so still, but I didn't dare move. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything. Breathing, shuffling. Another footstep. Nothing. Finally, I dared to reach for my flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed it at the tent wall. No shadows. No movement. I listened for a few more minutes before slowly unzipping the door. The cold night air rushed in as I shined my light outside. The fire's embers glowed softly. The surrounding trees stood still. I stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. My breath was visible in the cold air. I moved the beam of light slowly, scanning the area. No signs of movement, no tracks. The ground was covered in a layer of dead leaves, but nothing looked disturbed. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting, but there was nothing. Eventually, I put more wood on the fire, making it bright again, and sat by it. Sleep wouldn't come easily after that. The rest of the night passed without incident. Morning came, and with it a feeling of unease. I had been alone. I was sure of it, but the footsteps had been real. I checked the area again, looking for any evidence of someone or something having been there. Nothing. I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me refused to let fear dictate my trip. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe the sounds had been from an animal, and I had overreacted. I convinced myself of that and decided to stay another night. The second day went by smoothly. I hiked further out, collected more firewood, and enjoyed the quiet. But as the sun began to set, the unease crept back in. I forced myself to ignore it, cooking dinner and keeping the fire going strong. When I crawled into my tent that night, I kept my knife closer, my flashlight within reach. Sleep came slowly. Every little sound made me tense. But exhaustion eventually won. A noise woke me again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, steady, just outside the tent. My skin went cold. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. I could hear it, deep inhales, slow exhales. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind. It was something standing right outside my tent, breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence. A few minutes passed, then footsteps, moving away this time. Slowly, deliberately, I stayed frozen, waiting. The sounds faded. I waited longer. When I finally gathered the courage, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The fire was low but still burning. Nothing moved. The trees stood silent. I packed up my gear before the sun even rose. I didn't wait. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I hiked faster than I ever had, not stopping until I reached my truck. As I drove away, I felt it, that deep, unsettling feeling that I had been watched, that I hadn't been alone, that whoever or whatever had been out there had let me leave. I never went back. I remember the trip like it was yesterday. The plan was simple. Take a few days off, drive out to a secluded camping spot in the mountains, and disconnect from everything. I wanted solitude. No work, no noise, no phone calls. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I had picked a location that wasn't on the usual camping maps, a place I had found on an old hiking forum. The directions were vague, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be alone, away from crowded campsites and busy trails. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few essentials. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to a dirt path, and soon I was navigating rocky terrain with no clear signs. My truck bounced along the uneven ground as I followed the GPS coordinates. There were no tire tracks, no signs of recent visitors. That made me feel even better. I wanted isolation, and I had found it. The sun was already dipping below the treetops when I finally reached a small clearing near a river. It was perfect. Flat ground, a water source, and no sign of human activity. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As darkness settled in, the silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant hum of civilization. just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of insects. I ate my dinner by the fire, enjoying the crisp mountain air. Everything felt peaceful. I stayed up for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the night. Eventually, I climbed into my tent and zipped it up. The fabric felt thin against the vast wilderness, but I was used to camping alone. I wasn't worried. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had died down to embers, and everything was pitch black. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal's quick, scurrying steps. These were slow and deliberate. My mind raced. I had seen no other people on the way here, no vehicles, no campsites. Who else would be out here? I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. I tried to go back to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, stretching. The forest was peaceful again, the river flowing nearby. But something was off. My gear had been moved. Not much, just small things. My flashlight, which I had placed beside me before sleeping, was now near the fire pit. My backpack was unzipped, though nothing seemed to be missing. I felt uneasy but tried to shake it off. Maybe I had just been careless. Maybe I had knocked things around in my sleep. I told myself not to overthink it. I spent the day exploring. I hiked along the river, took some photos, and enjoyed the quiet. By the time I returned, the sun was already lowering again. I started another fire and cooked a simple meal. As the night deepened, that eerie feeling returned. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness. It was that strange sense of being watched, the same feeling I'd had since waking up. I reassured myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I made sure to keep my flashlight within reach as I climbed into my tent. I barely slept. Every little sound jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, faint, almost like the wind, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up, gripping my knife, listening. The whispering stopped. Then came the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. Whoever or whatever was out there was standing still, just waiting. I wanted to look outside, to shine my light and see, but fear kept me frozen. I couldn't move. I didn't want to know. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, bare human footprints circling my tent. My firewood was scattered. My gear had been moved again. But the worst part was what I found hanging from a tree branch nearby. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine, in the shape of a person. I didn't waste time. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my tent and supplies into my truck. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. Deep in the trees just beyond the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the truck into gear and drove, bouncing over the rough trail, not stopping until I reached the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was some hermit living off the grid. Maybe it was something worse. I never went back to find out. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise of everyday life, clear my head, and spend a few nights alone in the wilderness. I picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites. I wanted complete isolation, just me and nature. I packed all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, knife, and a small axe. I even brought a notebook, thinking I might jot down some thoughts while sitting by the fire at night. The hike to the campsite was tougher than I expected. The terrain was uneven, the trail overgrown. I followed a narrow dirt path through thick trees, stepping over fallen branches and carefully navigating around exposed roots. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I could hear my own breathing, my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves. Every so often, A bird would call from somewhere in the trees, but for the most part, it was just me and the forest. By the time I reached the spot I had chosen, the sun was already starting to lower in the sky. I set up my tent near a small clearing close to a shallow stream. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I took my time gathering firewood, making sure I had enough to last through the night. Once the fire was going, I sat down and ate a simple meal: some jerky, a granola bar, and a bottle of water. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling in the bushes, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. The second day, I decided to explore the area a little. I followed the stream for a while, moving deeper into the woods. I found a few animal tracks in the mud, deer maybe, or something similar. The air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. I shook the thought away and continued walking. After a few hours, I turned back toward camp. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The woods were different at night. Shadows stretched in unnatural ways. Tree branches swayed even when there was no wind. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light over the campsite. I listened, straining to hear beyond the normal sounds of the forest. Then I caught its soft, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. My heart pounded. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling the tent. It wasn't an animal. Animals move erratically, but this was different. This was controlled, purposeful. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped again, right outside the entrance of the tent. I stared at the thin fabric separating me from whoever or whatever was on the other side. I wanted to unzip it, to look, but my instincts screamed at me to stay still. Minutes passed. The silence was unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally allowing myself to breathe again. The next morning, I searched the area around my tent. There were no footprints, nothing to indicate that someone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. It hadn't been a dream. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself that if something had wanted to harm me, it would have done so last night. I convinced myself to stay one more night. That day, I stuck close to camp, keeping my knife within reach at all times. As the sun began to set, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat with my back against a tree, my ears tuned to every sound. It happened again that night. The footsteps returned, circling my tent just like before. But this time, they didn't stop at the entrance. They moved closer to the fire, then back toward the trees. I could hear slow, deliberate breathing, deep, steady inhales and exhales. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay another night. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling branch sent a wave of fear through me. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but I never did. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then, without looking back, I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that spot. I never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. And I know, without a doubt, that I was not alone in those woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful. and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies: food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined: calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something: branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they were, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling, My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo camping trip deep in the mountains, far from crowded campgrounds and weekend hikers. I wanted complete solitude, just me, the trees, and the sound of a distant river. I had all my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, extra layers for the cold nights, and my rifle just in case. I wasn't worried about animals. It was people I was cautious about. The drive to the trailhead was long and rough, miles of winding dirt roads, no signs of other vehicles. I parked in a small clearing and locked up, making sure everything was secured. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. The plan was to hike in about 10 miles, set up camp by a lake I had marked on my map, stay a couple of nights, and hike back. No distractions, no technology, just pure, uninterrupted nature. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The sun was high, the air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. The further I went, the quieter it became, just the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustling in the bushes. Probably just squirrels or birds. The terrain was steep at points, but I pushed through, my muscles aching in a good way. I had done longer hikes before. This was nothing new. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, but it was beautiful. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like glass. There were no signs of human presence, no fire pits, no footprints, nothing. That's exactly what I wanted. I set my pack down, stretched, and started setting up my tent. I cleared an area, pitched my tent, and gathered some firewood before the sun started dipping behind the trees. The temperature dropped quickly, so I got a fire going and boiled some water for a meal. As I ate, I watched the treeline. Everything was still. It was too quiet. I had been in the woods enough times to know that silence wasn't normal. There should have been birds, insects, something. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe I was just tired. I put out the fire, secured my food away from camp, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening. Every small sound made me tense up. The wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Normal forest sounds. I forced myself to relax. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the night, I woke up. A sound outside. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded as I reached for my rifle. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. The fabric of the tent barely moved, but I could feel someone standing there, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slow, unhurried. I didn't move. I stayed there, gripping my rifle, waiting for the sun. As soon as light broke, I stepped out, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. I packed up fast. The idea of spending another night there didn't sit right with me. I decided to hike back, cutting my trip short. As I made my way back, I kept checking behind me. I felt watched. The feeling didn't go away. Halfway through the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A boot print, not mine, fresh. Someone had followed me. I moved faster. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and took off. I didn't relax until I was miles away. I never went back to that spot. Maybe it was just a random hiker, maybe not, but I wasn't about to find out. Some places are better left alone. I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had always loved the quiet, the feeling of being completely disconnected from everything. The forest I chose was about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the mountains, and I had done enough research to know that hardly anyone went there. It was perfect, or at least that's what I thought. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and other essentials. I had been camping alone before, so I wasn't too worried about it. The plan was simple. Hike to a good spot by a small lake I had found on a map, set up camp, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people had been through here. The hike was longer than I expected. The path was uneven, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finally reached the lake. It was beautiful, untouched. The water was still, reflecting the deep greens of the forest around it. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that made you feel small. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. The night air was crisp, and I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Usually, you could hear insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, maybe even a distant howl from a coyote. But there was nothing, just silence. I shook it off, convincing myself that it was just because I was in such a remote place. After finishing my meal, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I was tired from the hike, and sleep came quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't a slow wake-up. I was instantly alert, my heart pounding. Something was outside. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves just beyond my tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear more, but there was only silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the quick, skittish movements of a wild animal. It was slow, purposeful. I stayed still, waiting. A long time passed, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. I unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The forest was still quiet, but the feeling from the night before was gone. I packed up my things, making sure I left no trace behind. Before leaving, I walked down to the lake to splash some water on my face. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, there were footprints. Human footprints. They led from the treeline to the water and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone camping over there. No indication that someone had walked away. Just the prints leading to the edge of the water. And then nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been there, watching me, maybe while I slept. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. Then, without thinking, I grabbed my bag and started hiking out. I didn't run, but I moved fast. Every so often, I stopped and listened. The silence was heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was behind me. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me the whole way until I reached my car. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that forest. I still think about those footprints sometimes, about the silence, about the slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I know that someone was out there, and they were watching me. I was looking for a break from my routine, something different from my usual weekends spent indoors. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been camping before, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted the quiet, the isolation. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from people. I planned everything carefully, packing my gear, making sure I had enough food, and choosing a remote spot deep in the forest. The place I picked was about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a lesser-known camping area, which meant fewer people, maybe none at all. That's what I wanted. I drove most of the way and then hiked the last few miles with my backpack. The path was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a lake. It was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it. I set up my tent near the edge, just close enough to hear the water but far enough to be safe. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean scent you only find deep in the woods. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the cool evening air. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, watching the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky. It was peaceful. I didn't feel scared or uneasy, just relaxed. At some point, I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. I assumed it was an animal. I had read about deer and small critters in the area. I ignored it, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of rustling made by the wind or a small animal moving through leaves. It was slower, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my fire. The noise stopped. It was probably my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone. I stayed up for a while longer before deciding to sleep. I put out the fire and got into my tent. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional sound of insects. I closed my eyes, listening to the stillness. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, my tent completely zipped up, but something felt wrong. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping for long moments before continuing. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. My car was parked miles away, and this spot wasn't easy to find. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Just standing there, I could feel my breath shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound of fabric, someone pressing against my tent. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I took down my tent. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the trail. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line, watching me. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I didn't wait. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and I don't want to find out. I was never the kind of person to go on camping trips alone. I always thought that going into the woods alone was asking for trouble. But after a rough couple of months, I felt like I needed to clear my head. A weekend alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to escape. No phone, no internet, just the sounds of nature and nothing else. I planned everything carefully. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the main trails but not too isolated. I packed enough food, a good tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and some basic survival gear. I told my friend where I was going and when I'd be back, just in case. Felt safe enough. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. It was a remote place, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. I parked, strapped on my backpack, and started hiking. The air smelled fresh, the trees swayed in the wind, and the sun was still high in the sky. Everything felt peaceful. After about 4 hours of hiking, I found a perfect spot near a small stream. It was flat, surrounded by thick trees, and had enough open space for a fire. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started cooking a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in my jacket. The night was quiet, too quiet. I had expected the usual sounds, crickets, maybe an owl, but there was nothing. Just silence. It felt odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside. It wasn't the wind. It was too steady, too deliberate. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound moved, slow but steady, circling my tent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but something about it didn't feel right. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. If I turned it on, I'd either see nothing and feel stupid or I'd see something I didn't want to. But the sound kept going. My hands were shaking as I clicked the light on and unzipped the tent just a little. I shined the beam outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The rustling had stopped. My heart was still hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Maybe whatever it was had run off. I zipped the tent back up, turned off the flashlight, and lay there staring at the fabric above me. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing little sounds, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I almost laughed at myself for getting so worked up. I made some coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to go exploring. I followed the stream for a while, enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, I turned back toward camp. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, slightly deeper than mine, and led straight toward my tent. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen a single person since I started hiking. I crouched down, tracing the prints with my fingers. They were human, not boot prints, barefoot. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I followed the prints back toward my campsite. They circled my tent, the fire pit, and then stopped near a tree before vanishing into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I packed up fast. I didn't care if it cut my trip short. I wasn't staying another night. I shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking back to my car, moving fast. Every sound made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched never left me. It took half the time to get back to my car, but it felt like forever. When I finally reached it, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and peeled out of there, my heart racing. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I know what I saw. Someone had been out there, watching me, following me. I haven't gone camping alone since. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything: work, the noise of the city, and just life in general. The idea was simple: pack my gear, drive deep into the woods, and spend a few days alone in complete silence. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. I had done solo camping before, so I wasn't worried. The location I chose was a remote forest about 4 hours from home. It wasn't a popular campsite. In fact, it was barely marked on maps. I had found it while researching lesser-known hiking spots, and from what I read, it was perfect. Deep in the woods, far from any main road, and rarely visited. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed my essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small gas stove, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife for safety. I also carried a map and compass even though I had a GPS watch. I wasn't a fool. I knew how easily technology could fail in the wild. I loaded everything into my truck and set off early in the morning. The drive was long, the last hour spent on a dirt road that seemed forgotten by time. Trees lined both sides, their thick trunks casting deep shadows over the path. There were no signs, no tire tracks, just wilderness. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where I could park. From there, I had to hike about 2 miles to reach the spot I had chosen. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was barely a trail, more of a suggestion of a path, with overgrown bushes and uneven ground. It was quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried away. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. After about 40 minutes, I found the spot. It was perfect. A small, flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a slight slope leading down to a stream. The water was clear and cold, perfect for drinking after boiling. The air smelled fresh, untouched by pollution or the artificial scent of the city. I set down my pack and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up first, secured properly with stakes driven deep into the ground. I gathered some firewood, stacking it neatly near the fire pit I dug out. I made sure to keep my food sealed tight. Bears were always a concern, even if I hadn't seen any sign of them yet. As the sun began to dip, I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, some canned beans and rice. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me going. That first night was peaceful. The sounds of the forest were soothing, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up through the small mesh window of my tent at the dark sky speckled with stars. I drifted off easily, feeling safe and alone in the best way. The next morning, I woke up early, stretched, and started a small fire to heat some water for coffee. As I sipped from my metal cup, I decided to explore a bit. I wasn't in a hurry. I had no strict plans, just time to kill. I walked along the stream, following it deeper into the woods. The further I went, the denser the forest became. The trees loomed higher, their branches thick with moss. Then, I noticed something that made me stop. A footprint. It was fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil near the water's edge. My first thought was that it was my own, but the size was wrong. It was bigger, wider. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. I crouched down, touching the print. It hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever left it had passed through recently. I stood up and turned back toward my camp, walking a little faster than before. My senses were alert now, every sound seeming sharper, every movement in the trees catching my eye. By the time I reached my tent, I felt that strange sensation of being watched. I shook it off. This was a forest, after all. It wasn't unusual for another hiker or hunter to be out here, but something about it felt off. I spent the next few hours staying close to camp, keeping my knife within reach. The day passed slowly. I tried to relax, but that feeling of unease never left. As the sun began to set, I gathered more firewood, making sure to build a strong flame. Fire kept animals away, but it also gave me a sense of security. I sat close to it, eating another simple meal, my eyes scanning the trees. Then, just as darkness fully settled, I heard it, a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but beyond that, the forest was still. Then another crunch, closer this time. I slowly reached for my knife, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then nothing. Minutes passed. No more sounds. I stayed up for hours watching, waiting. The fire burned down to glowing embers, but I refused to move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I retreated to my tent, leaving the knife beside me as I lay down. Sleep came in short bursts, my mind on edge. By morning, I was drained. The forest was bright and alive again, but I couldn't shake the tension. I needed to make a decision. Stay another night or pack up and leave. I had planned to stay 3 days, but something was telling me I shouldn't push my luck. Then I saw it. Near the edge of my camp, a small pile of rocks stacked deliberately that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, close to my tent, while I slept. That was it. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack without care. I doused the fire, slung my gear onto my back, and started moving. My walk back to the truck was fast, almost a jog. I didn't look back, didn't stop. When I reached my vehicle, I threw my bag into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I didn't know who was out there, and I didn't want to find out. That remote, peaceful spot I had chosen turned out to be anything but. I drove home, not stopping until I was safely parked in my driveway. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I replayed everything in my head. The footprint, the footsteps, the stacked rocks. Someone had been watching me. Someone had come close enough to my tent to leave a sign. I love the outdoors, but I've never gone camping alone again. And I don't think I ever will. I always loved camping alone. There was something about the quiet of the woods, the isolation, and the simplicity of it all that made me feel at peace. I never worried about safety too much. Sure, I brought a knife and a first aid kit, but I never thought anything serious would happen. People go camping all the time. They hike, they set up their tents, they sit by the fire, and then they go home with nothing but sore legs and good memories. That was always my experience until one particular trip changed everything. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no calls, no people. Just me and the wilderness. I found a remote camping area deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a place I had found after hours of looking at maps. An area that seemed untouched, perfect for some solitude. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, and my usual essentials. I even brought a small fishing rod, hoping to catch something fresh for dinner. The hike to the spot was long and tough. The terrain was uneven, and at times I had to push through thick undergrowth. But the effort was worth it. When I finally arrived, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving river. The trees around the clearing were tall and dense, blocking most of the wind. The river provided a steady sound of flowing water, which was oddly calming. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the water that I could hear it, but not so close that the ground was damp. I gathered some wood for a fire and got everything in order before the sun set. As the evening came, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I would hear a branch snap in the distance or the rustling of leaves, but that was normal. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had bear spray with me just in case, but I wasn't worried. I had camped enough times to know what to expect. After finishing my meal, I cleaned up and made sure all my food was secured away from my tent. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep easily, the sounds of the river and the fire dying down lulling me into rest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. My fire had gone out completely, and the only sound was the faint trickle of water from the river. I didn't know why I woke up, but something felt off. I lay still, listening, waiting. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the random noises of animals moving through the underbrush. These were slow, deliberate steps. They were close. Too close. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed still, listening, hoping that I was imagining it. Then the footsteps started again. They moved around the clearing, circling my tent. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped again, just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing right there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Felt like forever. Then, Just as quietly as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they faded into the woods until I could hear nothing but the river again. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was out there? A hunter? Another camper? But why would they come so close to my tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped outside. My fire pit was undisturbed. My gear was untouched. But when I looked around the clearing, I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy prints that circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I had planned to stay for a few more nights, but I wasn't going to risk another night out there. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. It wasn't until I was back in my car, doors locked, that I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't want to announce themselves. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I never went camping alone again. I planned the camping trip because I needed a break from everything. Work had been stressful, my sleep schedule was messed up, and I hadn't been outside for more than a quick errand in weeks. I figured a couple of nights in the woods would help clear my head. I chose a spot deep in the forest, away from any official campgrounds. I wanted silence, just nature around me, no other people. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, my knife, a small hatchet, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old hiking boots, the ones that had carried me through so many trails before. The drive took a few hours, and by the time I reached the forest entrance, the sun was already beginning to dip. I parked at the last spot before the dirt trail began and loaded my backpack. The hike in was quiet. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, dense and still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the crunch of my boots on the path. It felt good being out there alone. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a spot that seemed perfect, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. The trees provided enough cover to break the wind, and the ground was flat enough for my tent. I set up quickly, getting my tent pitched before dark. I gathered some wood for a fire and made a small dinner from the food I'd packed. The quietness of the forest was relaxing. No city noise, no buzzing of my phone. Just me, the crackling fire, and the cool night air. As I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I heard something in the distance. A branch snapping. I froze, listening. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even the wind. I told myself not to overthink it, but I still felt uneasy. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the darkness, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I didn't see anything unusual. After a few more minutes, I shook off the feeling and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I laid there listening, but eventually sleep took over. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. I lay still, straining to hear any sound outside the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you'd hear insects, night birds, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. But there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness. My pulse started racing. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but I heard nothing else. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Animals don't walk like that. They don't move with that kind of caution. I stayed awake for a long time, my knife still in my hand, but eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising. I stepped out of the tent and immediately checked the area around my camp. Nothing looked disturbed, but I still felt unsettled. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the silence of the night. I made breakfast, packed up some snacks, and decided to go for a short hike to clear my head. The woods felt different in the daylight, less threatening, more peaceful. I followed the creek upstream, moving carefully over the damp rocks. The sound of the water was soothing, and I started to relax again. That was until I noticed something strange. A footprint in the mud, just off the bank of the creek. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, still wet around the edges. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I turned back immediately, walking quickly but not running. I didn't want to make it obvious that I knew someone was around. My mind was racing. Who else would be this deep in the woods? There were no other campsites nearby. I hadn't seen a single person since I started hiking in. When I got back to my camp, everything was as I left it. My gear was untouched, my tent still zipped up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to pack up early and leave. I had planned to stay another night, but something about that footprint didn't sit right with me. I wasn't going to risk it. I moved fast, stuffing everything into my pack, putting out the fire completely, and making sure I left nothing behind. I started the hike back towards my car, keeping my knife in my hand this time. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Halfway back, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Another footprint, this time right in the middle of the trail. It was fresh. The mud was still wet, and it wasn't there when I had hiked in the day before. Someone was following me, or worse, someone had gotten ahead of me. I didn't waste any more time. I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. My heart was pounding. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. The trees felt like they were closing in around me. I just wanted to get to my car and get the hell out of there. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried in relief. I ran the last stretch, unlocked the doors, and threw my pack inside. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror, scanning the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trail. Too far to make out any details, but close enough to know they had been watching me. I didn't stick around. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road until I hit pavement. My hands were shaking the entire drive home. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just another camper, maybe it wasn't, but I haven't been back to that forest since, and I don't think I ever will. I was alone in the cabin, miles away from the nearest road, deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place to get away from the noise of the city, to clear my head. A friend had told me about it, said it belonged to his uncle but was rarely used. He assured me it was safe, isolated, and perfect for some time alone. The drive out there had been long, the roads narrowing into winding dirt paths that cut through thick trees. The sun had already started to dip behind the treetops when I arrived. The cabin was old but sturdy, built from thick logs, with a slanted roof and a small porch. A single window at the front looked out onto nothing but trees. Inside, it was basic but comfortable. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner. A small kitchen with an ancient refrigerator hummed softly, and a single bed with a heavy wool blanket waited for me in the back. There was no TV, no internet, and barely a signal on my phone. That was the point. I wanted silence. The first night was uneventful. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I read a book by candlelight since the cabin's single light bulb flickered constantly. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The second day, I decided to explore the woods a bit. I had packed light, just some food, water, and a hunting knife for protection. The forest was thick, the air damp and cool even in the middle of the day. I followed a narrow deer trail, stepping carefully over fallen branches and patches of moss. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something strange. A clearing, small and unnatural, with a pile of rocks stacked in a perfect, precise column. It wasn't random. Someone had placed them that way, carefully balanced, one on top of the other. I felt a chill but shrugged it off. Maybe just some hiker or hunter playing around. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals. just stillness. I turned back toward the cabin. The way back felt longer than it should have. The trees seemed closer together, the path unfamiliar even though I knew I hadn't strayed far. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, relief flooded through me. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to nerves and overthinking. That night, the noises started. First, just small things. A twig snapping outside. A soft rustling sound. Animals, I told myself. Just the woods doing what they do. Then came the tapping. Light, deliberate. Not the random scratch of branches against the cabin, but something rhythmic. Came from the window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The candle had burned low, casting long shadows. I stayed still, listening. The tapping stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Maybe a bird? Some animal attracted to the light? I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, no signs of anything near the window. I spent the day trying to push the fear away. I chopped some firewood, made myself a simple meal, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun set, the dread crept back in. That night, the noises were worse. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I lay in bed, gripping the hunting knife, my breathing shallow. The footsteps stopped near the window. Then came the tapping again. I forced myself up, moving as silently as I could. The floor creaked beneath me. I reached the window, heart hammering. Nothing, just darkness. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but no sign of movement. I barely slept. By the third day, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bag, threw it in the truck, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. I checked under the hood, even though I wasn't a mechanic. Everything looked fine, but the truck wouldn't turn over. I was stuck. I told myself I'd hike out in the morning, follow the road back to the nearest town. It would take hours, but I didn't have a choice. That night, something changed. The noises didn't come from outside this time. They came from inside. A creak in the kitchen. The sound of something shifting. I stayed perfectly still in the bed. The knife clutched so tight my fingers ached. Then breathing. Slow. Steady. Not mine. I couldn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, stretched into an eternity. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't bother with food, didn't lock the cabin behind me. I just ran. I followed the road, moving fast despite my exhaustion. The forest felt suffocating, the trees pressing in. Hours passed. My legs burned, my throat dry. Then, finally, the road widened, and I saw a small gas station in the distance. I stumbled inside, breathless, shaking. The attendant gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I just needed to call someone. Anyone. When help arrived, I didn't have the words to explain, just that I needed to get out of there. A week later, my friend called me, said his uncle had gone to check on the cabin. He found the door open, my truck still sitting there. But inside, things were different. The bed was made. The kitchen was clean. My bags were gone. But there was something else. On the window, written in the condensation, was a single word. Stay. I never went back. I never should have come out here. That thought ran through my mind over and over again as I stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the old cabin. It was late autumn, and the air had that sharp, dry chill that crept into my bones. The trees around me were almost bare, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Brown and orange leaves covered the forest floor, crunching under my boots as I made my way up the creaking wooden steps. The cabin was old, probably abandoned for years. The roof sagged slightly, and the wooden walls were weathered and cracked. The door had been left ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, the rusted hinges groaning softly. I had been hiking all day, and with the sun dipping lower behind the trees, I knew I had no choice. I had to stay here for the night. I stepped inside, pushing the door open slowly, letting the last light of the day spill in. The inside was just as bad as the outside. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the room like old, forgotten curtains. There was a small wooden table in the center, its surface scratched and worn. A single chair lay tipped over beside it. In the corner, there was a fireplace, its stones blackened with soot, but no wood stacked nearby. Across the room, an old wooden cot sat against the wall, the mattress nothing more than a thin, discolored pad that had been gnawed at by time and, most likely, mice. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No signal. Not surprising. I was miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods. I had planned on hiking to a ranger station, but I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and by the time I realized it, I was too far off course. With the sun setting and no idea where I actually was, I knew I had to make the best of it. I gathered some of the driest pieces of wood I could find outside and stacked them in the fireplace. Took longer than I wanted, but eventually, I got a small fire going. The warmth helped ease the tension in my muscles, but my mind was still uneasy. Something about this place didn't feel right. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the cot, and pulled out an energy bar from my bag. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind rustled through the trees, and occasionally, I heard the distant hoot of an owl. But then there were other sounds, strange, soft noises, like something moving through the leaves, stopping, then starting again. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a fox, but as I sat there, staring into the fire, the noises didn't stop. They got closer. My pulse quickened. I turned off my headlamp and moved closer to the window, careful not to make any noise. Peering through the cracked glass, I saw only darkness. The firelight behind me created a faint reflection, and I had to lean in to see anything beyond it. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree trunk, just another shadow among many. But then it moved. A figure. It was standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving toward the cabin. It wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Every rational part of me screamed that it had to be a person, maybe a hunter or another lost hiker. But deep down, something told me that wasn't the case. There was something off about the way it stood, so still, so silent. I forced myself to turn away and focus on the fire. Maybe it would lose interest and leave. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt its presence. I knew it was still there, watching. Then, a sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate tap against the wooden wall of the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. I jumped to my feet, grabbing the small hunting knife from my pack. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, knife gripped tightly in my shaking hand, every muscle in my body tense. The fire crackled behind me, the only sound in the room. Then the doorknob turned. Not fast, not violently, just a slow, quiet twist, as if someone on the other side was testing it. I stepped back, holding my breath, praying that it was just my imagination. But then the door creaked open, just an inch, just enough for me to see the darkness beyond it. I didn't move, couldn't. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door remained slightly open, but there were no footsteps, no movement, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, my back against the farthest wall, my knife in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, I was still wide awake. I stood slowly, my entire body stiff and aching. I crept to the door and pushed it open fully, stepping outside. The forest was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. In the dirt, just beyond the steps, were footprints. They led from the tree-line to the cabin. But the strangest part? There were no footprints leading away. I grabbed my pack and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my legs burning, my lungs aching. Eventually, I made it back to civilization, back to safety. I never found out who or what was out there that night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. I needed a break from everything. Work had been dragging me down, and the city was starting to feel suffocating. The noise, the crowds, the constant hum of life that never seemed to quiet down. I had enough. So, when I got the chance to rent a secluded cabin deep in the woods for a week, I took it without hesitation. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to clear my head. The drive up was long, stretching through winding roads that twisted through dense forest. The farther I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No gas stations, no houses, not even another car. Just endless trees and the occasional deer darting across the road. I had followed the directions the owner of the cabin sent me, and after about an hour off the main highway, I finally found it. A small wooden cabin, tucked away in the trees, far from anything or anyone. It was perfect. No cell service, no neighbors, just quiet. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, got the firewood stacked, and settled in. The cabin was simple, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living area with a fireplace. No electricity, but a generator in the back if I needed it. I decided to leave it off. I wanted to disconnect completely. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the leaves, crickets chirped in the distance, and every now and then, I'd hear the faint hoot of an owl. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly alone. It was nice. Sometime around midnight, I decided to turn in. As I was locking up, I noticed something strange. There were footprints on the dirt path leading away from the cabin. I hadn't noticed them earlier. At first, I thought maybe they were mine, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were too big, and they weren't leading toward the cabin. They were leading away. I told myself it could have been the owner, maybe checking on the place before I arrived. But something about them unsettled me. They were deep, fresh. Someone had been there. Recently, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. Maybe it was nothing. I went inside, locked the doors, and went to bed. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it hiking, exploring the area, trying to clear my head. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. That's when I noticed it. Something was off. The firewood I had stacked neatly by the door was scattered. The door to the generator shed was open. I knew I had closed it. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out if maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe the wind knocked over the wood. Maybe I hadn't latched the shed door properly. But I knew I had. I checked inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. But that feeling something was wrong. That night, I slept with the fire burning low in the fireplace, the warmth doing little to calm my nerves. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood settling. And then I heard it. Soft, slow, footsteps. Outside. I froze, listened. They weren't heavy, not stomping or running. Just slow, deliberate steps crunching on the dirt outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear more. For a moment, everything was still. The footsteps stopped. Then a knock. Soft. 3 taps. My heart slammed against my ribs. No one was supposed to be here. No one even knew I was here. I didn't move. I just sat there, waiting, listening. The knock came again. Same rhythm. 3 soft taps. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the fireplace, gripping it tight. I wasn't about to open that door. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, retreating this time, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a bear brushing against the cabin. Maybe a tree branch tapping in the wind. I was just being paranoid. Still, I checked outside. The footprints were back, fresh, leading away from the cabin. I had enough. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. When I finally got service hours later, I called the cabin owner, told him about what happened. He was quiet for a long time before he finally said, "You're not the first." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know, and I never went back. I had always wanted a place to escape to, somewhere far from the noise and stress of the city. So, when I found an old cabin deep in the Montana wilderness for sale, I didn't hesitate. It was secluded, surrounded by thick pine forests, and miles away from the nearest town. Exactly what I was looking for. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my time fixing up the place, chopping wood, and exploring the surrounding forest. The silence was something I wasn't used to, but I liked it. No cars, no neighbors, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. One evening, I was out by the fire pit, watching the flames flicker when I first noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I brushed it off as paranoia, but something inside me knew better. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My first thought was a bear, maybe an elk, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was slow, almost thoughtful, like it was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. I grabbed my rifle and stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. Nothing. The trees stood still, the dirt road leading up to the cabin empty. I scanned the area for tracks, but there was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things and went back inside. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I'd be chopping wood and feel eyes on me, but every time I looked around, there was nothing. My game cameras weren't picking up anything unusual either, just deer and the occasional fox. But at night, the noises started again. First, it was just the footsteps, always circling, always just far enough that I couldn't see anything. Then, things started moving. One morning, I found my tools scattered across the ground, like someone had gone through them. A few days later, I woke up to find the firewood I had stacked neatly by the cabin tossed across the yard. Nothing was taken, nothing was damaged, just moved. That's when I decided to stay up all night and wait. I killed the lights in the cabin, grabbed my rifle and sat by the window. The hours dragged by, the only sound my own breathing. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling. Then, something new. A faint scraping sound against the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I waited, gripping my rifle so tight my fingers ached. The scraping moved around, from one side of the cabin to the other. It sounded like nails or claws dragging against the wood. I took a deep breath and flipped on the porch light. Nothing. I stepped outside, flashlight sweeping across the trees. The moment the beam hit the tree line, I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the light. It was tall, too tall. The proportions were all wrong. Long limbs, broad shoulders, a head tilted slightly to the side as if studying me. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My breath hitched and I raised my rifle. But before I could even aim, it was gone. Not ran, not ducked, just gone. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I found deep scratches in the wood near my bedroom window. Not claw marks, not anything an animal would make. They were long, deliberate slashes, like someone had taken a knife and carved into the wood. I packed up and left that afternoon. I never went back. Months later, I listed the cabin for sale. A man from out of state bought it without asking too many questions. I didn't feel the need to warn him. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sticking around to find out more. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, expecting to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps circling outside my window. And every time I do, I remind myself why I never should have gone to that cabin in the first place. It was late September when I drove up into the mountains alone. I had taken time off from work, looking for somewhere quiet to clear my head, and booked a small, off-grid cabin deep in the woods of Montana. The place was advertised as remote, No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a well. That was exactly what I wanted. A break from everything. The drive took longer than expected. The roads were in worse shape than the directions had suggested, narrow and covered in loose gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees. It was smaller than I expected, just a single-room structure with a tiny front porch and a detached shed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The nearest town was over an hour away. There was no cell service. I unloaded my supplies and set up inside. The cabin was simple. Wooden walls, a small table, a cot in the corner. There was a pile of firewood stacked against the back wall, enough to last a few days. A kerosene lantern sat on a shelf near the door, and a few dusty pots and pans hung on the wall. I found a journal tucked under the cot, filled with entries from previous visitors. Most were short notes about enjoying the peace and quiet, but one stood out. Something isn't right here. Heard noises last night. Thought it was animals, but it wasn't. Left early. I closed the book and set it aside. Probably some paranoid city person not used to the sounds of the woods at night. The first night was uneventful. The forest was alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, the occasional owl, the distant rustling of trees. I slept well, better than I had in weeks. The second day, I hiked a few miles into the woods, following an old trail behind the cabin. The deeper I went, the more overgrown it became until it eventually disappeared altogether. I turned back before it got too late. That night, I woke up to a sound outside, something moving through the trees, slow and deliberate. I sat up, listening. The fire in the stove had died down, and the cabin was cold. The sound didn't go away. I grabbed the lantern and stepped onto the porch. The forest was still dark. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but something about the way it moved felt off. I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Footprints, not animal tracks, human footprints circling the cabin. They weren't mine. They were barefoot, the toes pressing deep into the dirt. The prints led around the cabin several times before vanishing into the trees. I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself it was just some local messing around, maybe a hunter passing through. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I considered leaving, but convinced myself I was overreacting. I spent the day gathering firewood and trying to shake the feeling of unease. I didn't go hiking again. That night, I locked the door and kept the fire going. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin, but it wasn't enough to drown out the noise. Just past midnight, I heard something outside again. Closer this time. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob rattled. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Someone was out there trying to get in. I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood and stood by the door, listening. The rattling stopped. The footsteps moved around the cabin. I could hear them circling, pausing every few steps, like they were listening. Then silence. I stood there for hours, gripping the hatchet, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke, it was morning, and the world outside seemed normal again. But the footprints were back. Fresh ones, leading from the trees to my door, stopping right outside, then disappearing back into the woods. I packed my things, threw everything into my truck and left. As I drove away, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know. I had been driving for hours, deeper and deeper into the thick forests of northern Montana. The cabin was an old rental I found online, isolated on a stretch of land near a lake. The listing said it was built in the 1950s but had been updated a few times. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place to get away from the noise of the world. That's what I wanted. Just some time alone, away from people, away from everything. The drive up had been rough. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow, with trees pressing in on both sides. There were no streetlights, no signs of other people, just miles of forest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in deep reds and oranges. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered wood. It had a covered porch with a single rocking chair, a woodpile stacked neatly to the side, and a single dim porch light that flickered when I switched it on. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The main room had a fireplace, a couch, and a small kitchen area with an ancient-looking fridge and stove. There was one bedroom and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. The place was simple, but it was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no people, just me and the quiet. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read for a bit by the dim yellow light of the lamp, then turned in early. The forest outside was alive with sounds. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustling in the trees. I slept deeply, waking only once when the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The next morning, I took a walk down to the lake. The water was still dark, reflecting the towering pines around it. I sat on a rock by the shore, drinking coffee from my thermos, letting the cold air wake me up. It was perfect. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet in years. It was on my way back to the cabin that I noticed something strange. Deep boot prints in the dirt, leading toward the cabin from the woods. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard a car. I hadn't seen anyone else for miles. I stood there for a while, just listening. Nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. I followed the prints carefully, keeping my steps light. They led up to the porch, stopping just short of the door. Whoever it was had stood there for a while, facing the cabin. Then the prints turned and went back into the woods. No sign of them going around the cabin. No sign of them lingering. Just a straight path to my door and then back into the trees. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the tree line. There was no movement, no sound. Just the feeling that someone had been watching. I went inside, locked the door, and checked the windows. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept my hatchet near me that day, carrying it whenever I stepped outside. That night, I kept the porch light on. The wind picked up again, making the trees groan. I sat by the fire, trying to read, but I kept glancing at the windows. The feeling hadn't gone away. Something was off. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to a sound outside. A single, deliberate step on the porch. Then another. I froze, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows. I reached for my hatchet, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Just the wind. After what felt like an hour, I finally moved, creeping toward the window. The porch light flickered weakly, casting a dim glow, but I couldn't see anyone. I waited a little longer, then forced myself to lie back down. I barely slept. Morning came and I checked the porch. More prints. The same boots. This time, they circled the cabin, stopping at each window before disappearing back into the woods. I had planned to stay another few days, but my gut told me to leave. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching, waiting. I packed my things quickly, loading up my truck as the morning fog clung to the trees. I kept my hatchet close, my head on a swivel. As I was pulling out, I glanced back at the tree line. For just a second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing between the trunks, just out of reach of the light. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove straight out of there, all the way back to town without a break. When I got home, I checked the rental listing again. The cabin had been removed. No contact info. No record that it had ever been there. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this. I was not alone that night, and I was never supposed to find out who was watching me. It was early fall when I went up to the cabin. The trees were just starting to change color. The air had that crisp bite to it, and the nights were getting longer. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend away from everything, just me, the quiet, and the woods. I needed the break. Work had been wearing me down, and the thought of being completely alone for a few days sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine. He had inherited it from his grandfather, and since he rarely used it, he had offered to let me stay for the weekend. It was about a 4-hour drive from the city, deep in the woods, miles away from any real town. The road leading up to it was mostly dirt, twisting through thick trees and hills. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the ground. The place was simple, small, one-story, just a main room with a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a bathroom. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no distractions. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of an animal in the underbrush. I dropped my bag inside, took a quick look around, and then started getting things settled. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, read a book by the dim light of an old lamp, and went to bed early. The quiet was nice, though it took some time to get used to. I had spent so much time surrounded by noise, cars, people, the hum of the city, that the silence felt almost too loud. Still, I slept well. The next day, I spent most of my time outside. I hiked a little, walked down to the small lake a few hundred yards from the cabin, and just enjoyed the feeling of being away from everything. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I hadn't seen another person since I got here. That was the whole point, of course, but something about it felt off. Maybe I just wasn't used to being so isolated. That night, things changed. I was inside, reading, when I heard something outside. First, I thought it was just the wind. Then I heard it again. A thud. Not loud, but solid, like something hitting the wooden porch. I set my book down and listened. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer passing through. Still, I stood up and went to the window. The porch light barely reached past the railing, leaving most of the yard in darkness. I squinted, trying to see past the glow, but there was nothing, just the trees and the night. I waited a few minutes, then went back to my chair. I picked up my book, but I couldn't focus. Something about the noise had unsettled me. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was where it had come from. The porch was sturdy, raised slightly off the ground. Whatever made that noise had to be big enough to step onto it. An hour passed, then another. The sound didn't come back, and eventually, I convinced myself it really had just been an animal. I turned in for the night, locking the door behind me more out of habit than actual concern. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the dried leaves and dirt just beyond the porch. I lay still, barely breathing, listening as they circled the cabin. Every few steps, they would stop like whoever or whatever it was listening, waiting. Then they would start again, moving closer. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on, shining it toward the window. The curtain was thin, and I could see the faint outline of trees beyond the glass, but nothing else. I debated whether to get up and check outside, but something about this didn't feel right. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, heart pounding. Silence. Minutes passed. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe a sharp creak came from the porch. I sat up fast, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. The front door was locked, but that suddenly didn't feel like enough. I stayed still, listening. The creak didn't come again. The footsteps didn't start up. Just the same suffocating silence. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in bed, staring at the window, listening to every tiny sound. I told myself that if I heard something else, I would go out there with the flashlight and check. But I didn't hear anything. Not for the rest of the night. By morning, the fear felt like a bad dream. The light of day made everything seem normal again. The leaves outside were undisturbed. No sign of anything unusual. If there had been tracks, the dry ground had already erased them. I almost laughed at myself for getting so worked up. I spent most of the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. It worked for the most part. By the time the sun started to set, I was convinced I had just been imagining things. That night, I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and settled in. Around midnight, I woke up. Something was wrong. I didn't hear anything, but I could feel it. A pressure in the air, a sense of something just off. Then came the noise. Not footsteps this time. Something softer. A dragging sound. Slow, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound came from the side of the cabin, near the bedroom window. I grabbed the flashlight again, turned it on, and aimed it at the glass. The curtain barely moved in the still air, but beyond it, past the edge of the porch light's reach, I saw something shift, a shadow against the trees. I held my breath, waiting for it to move again. Didn't, but the dragging sound stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, watching, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but nothing happened. No more sounds, no more movement, just silence. By the time the first light of dawn touched the trees, I had already packed my bag. I didn't bother making breakfast. I didn't even check outside. I just grabbed my keys, threw everything into the car, and left. I never told my friend what happened. Never mentioned the noises, the shadow, the feeling of something just outside my window. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know I'll never go back to that cabin again. It was late October, right when the leaves were at their peak, bright red and orange covering the mountains like fire. I had rented a cabin for the weekend, just a small one, tucked away in the woods near a lake. It wasn't completely isolated. There were other cabins scattered throughout the forest, but they were far enough apart that I couldn't see them through the trees. It was the kind of place that felt remote without actually being too far from civilization, which was exactly what I was looking for. A quiet place to get away, enjoy the fresh air, maybe do some hiking. The cabin itself was simple. A single story with a porch, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with an old wood stove. The walls were dark wood, the furniture outdated but sturdy. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio that barely picked up any stations and a stack of old books on a shelf near the fireplace. It felt old but comfortable, like a place that had been there for decades and would stay standing for decades more. The first day was peaceful. I arrived in the afternoon, unpacked my things, and took a walk down to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the trees like glass. I didn't see another person the whole time I was out there. Just a few deer moving through the brush and a pair of birds circling overhead. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and every so often, I'd hear something moving through the underbrush, probably a raccoon or a fox. Normal forest sounds. Sometime around midnight, I went inside and locked the door. The cabin had old wooden shutters, so I pulled those closed too, just to keep the place extra dark. The bedroom was small but warm, the heavy quilts on the bed thick enough to keep the cold away. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up a few hours later, not to a sound exactly, but to a feeling, that strange, instinctual sense that something isn't right. The room was silent. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, leaving the air cool but not cold. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from outside the bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin was old, the wood settling at night, but this wasn't random creaking. It was slow, measured, a shift of weight on the old floorboards. I stayed completely still, ears straining. Then another sound, this one quieter, almost like a faint exhale. Someone was in the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone, didn't sit up. I just lay there listening. The door to the bedroom was closed, but there was no lock on it. If someone was out there, they could come in anytime they wanted. Another creak, closer this time. I ran through the possibilities in my head. A bear? Unlikely. A bear would have made more noise coming in. Maybe another camper who got lost? But what kind of lost camper would just walk into someone's cabin in the middle of the night? The floor creaked again, almost right outside the door now. I made a decision. Slowly, carefully, I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed the flashlight I'd left there. I held it tight, my heart hammering. Then silence. Minutes passed. My fingers ached from gripping the flashlight so hard. Nothing. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to move. I swung my legs off the bed as quietly as I could, putting my feet on the cold wooden floor. The cabin was still dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of embers in the stove. I took a slow, deep breath, then stood up. The floor didn't creak under my weight. I moved toward the door, stepping lightly. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I reached out, hesitated for just a second, then gripped the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open into the living room. It was empty. The front door was still locked. The shutters were still closed. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. The forest outside was quiet. Eventually, I convinced myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I had a dream that felt real. Maybe the cabin settling sounded like footsteps when I was half asleep. I didn't go back to bed, though. I sat in the chair near the stove, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the shutters. When the sun was fully up, I went outside to get some fresh air. The forest was peaceful again, birds calling to each other, leaves rustling in the wind. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were on the porch leading up to the front door, then back down the steps. I looked around, scanning the trees. The footprints weren't deep. Whoever made them hadn't been running, just walking. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of where they came from, no sign of where they went. I went back inside, packed up my things, and left. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. They stood outside my bedroom door, listening. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A weekend away, alone in a cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. Work, noise, people. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. It wasn't my first time doing something like this. I liked the solitude, the way the world slowed down when you were alone in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no distractions, just the crackle of a fire and the sounds of the forest at night. The cabin was small, nothing fancy. A single room with a bed, a small kitchen, a wood stove for heat. It had been there for decades, built by some old hunter long before I was born. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The kind of place that felt solid, like it had weathered storms and years without changing. The first day was perfect. I hiked in the afternoon, following a narrow trail that led up a ridge overlooking the valley. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't until later that I started to feel it, a shift in the air, a sense of something just beyond my sight. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it sometimes did when you were alone in a place like this. But as the night wore on, the feeling got stronger, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I locked the door before I went to bed. I always did, not because I was scared, but because it was just habit. You didn't leave doors unlocked, not out here. I left a lantern on the table, just bright enough to keep the room from being swallowed by the dark. Sleep came slow. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped, the old wood shifting as the night settled in. I listened for a while, letting the sounds lull me into sleep. But then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A noise outside, not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate. Slow, careful footsteps moving just beyond the cabin walls. I held my breath, straining to listen. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. The sound came again, closer this time. A soft crunch of leaves, the creak of a branch under weight. I stayed still, my body tense. I knew the sounds of the forest, knew the way animals moved. This wasn't that. This was different. A human step. I reached for the knife I kept near the bed, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence, stretching out, pressing in around me. I waited, barely breathing. Then, a soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. Just beneath the window, I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I thought about turning off the lantern, but I didn't want to move. Didn't want to let whoever was out there know that I knew. Instead, I stayed completely still, gripping the knife, listening. Minutes passed, then more. The night stretched on, the weight of the dark pressing down. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air went still again. Nothing moved outside. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening, waiting for something else to happen. But it never did. When the sun finally started to rise, I moved carefully to the window. The clearing outside looked the same as it had the day before. No signs of anything, no footprints, no disturbed leaves. But when I stepped outside, I saw it. A single mark just beneath the window. A long, deep scratch in the wood, like something or someone had dragged a knife or a sharp tool across it. Deliberate, intentional. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't look back. I haven't been back since. It was early November when I decided to spend a long weekend alone in an old hunting cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. I had always wanted to take a trip like this. Just me, a rifle, and miles of quiet forest. The cabin belonged to an old family friend who had stopped using it years ago, but it was still in decent shape, just a bit weathered from time. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a cot, and a few shelves stocked with old canned goods. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive took most of the day. By the time I reached the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops. The place was isolated, no cell service, no signs of human activity. Just towering pines, dry leaves crunching under my boots, and the occasional distant sound of a bird or some small animal scurrying through the brush. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The air was stale, but nothing a little fresh air and a fire in the stove couldn't fix. I swept some dirt and dead leaves off the floor, set my gear down, and got to work gathering firewood before it got too dark. There was a stack of logs on the side of the cabin, mostly dry but covered in cobwebs. I took an armful inside and got a fire going. Within an hour, the place felt warmer, the flickering glow of the flames bouncing off the wooden walls. That first night was peaceful. I ate a simple meal of jerky and some canned beans I had brought with me, washed it down with a bottle of water, and sat by the stove reading an old book I had packed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees and making the whole place creak. It was the kind of sound that could make a man feel completely alone in the world. But I wasn't worried. I was used to the woods. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag on the cot. The fire had burned down, but the embers still gave off enough heat to keep the chill away. The only sound was the wind, steady but not too strong. I closed my eyes and drifted off. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up. Something had snapped outside. A branch, maybe. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. A soft but deliberate crunch of leaves. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving just beyond the cabin walls. I stayed completely still, listening. My rifle was leaning against the wall, just out of reach. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. My heart pounded as the steps moved around the cabin, stopping near the window. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any other sounds. No breathing, no snorting, nothing that screamed bear or elk. Just slow, measured steps. Then they stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the sounds were gone. I stayed awake for hours, listening, gripping the knife I kept strapped to my belt. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I woke up, the sun was creeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. I stepped outside cautiously, my rifle in hand. There were tracks in the dirt, large, deep footprints circling the cabin. Not boots, not paws, bare feet. Human feet. But no one should have been out here. Not this deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. But someone or something had been watching me. I spent the next day on edge, carrying my rifle everywhere, constantly checking my surroundings. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it was just some lost hiker. Maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, the rifle in my hands as I sat in the chair by the stove, listening. But nothing happened. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear, doused the fire, and started the long trek back to my truck. As I reached the dirt road, something caught my eye. Carved into a tree near the trailhead was a single word, scratched deep into the bark. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove until I was back in town, back to civilization. I never told my family friend what I had seen, never asked if he had ever experienced anything like it. I never went back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to a weekend alone in the mountains for months. Work had been relentless, and I needed a break. Just me, a cabin, and miles of nothing. I found a place through a guy at work, a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods. He said it belonged to his uncle, who rarely used it anymore. I'd have no cell service, no internet, just a propane stove, a wood-burning heater, and a creek a short walk away for water. Sounded perfect. The drive up was long, winding through narrow mountain roads. The deeper I got into the woods, the fewer signs of people I saw. No houses, no mailboxes, just trees and the occasional break in the foliage revealing rolling hills. The last stretch was a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck, overgrown with branches that scraped against the sides as I drove. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly what I had wanted. Small, weathered, with a deep porch and a stone chimney. The forest pressed in close around it, thick with pine and underbrush. I parked, grabbed my gear, and stepped onto the porch. The door was unlocked, just as the guy had told me it would be. Inside, it was simple: wood walls, a small kitchen, a cot, and a fireplace with a pile of wood stacked beside it. The air smelled of dust and old wood, with a faint hint of something else, something damp. I chalked it up to the place being shut for so long. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag, and explored a little. The creek was close, just as he had said, and the water was ice cold and clear. I spent the afternoon gathering extra firewood, just in case the temperature dropped at night. As the sun set, I made a simple dinner on the propane stove and sat on the porch, listening to the woods come alive with sound. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. That night, I was woken by a noise. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the cabin settling, but then I heard it again, a thump, followed by a scraping sound. I sat up, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I stayed still, trying to hear past the sound of my own breathing. Then, nothing, just the wind and the trees. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. Not boot prints, not paws, something in between. Long, narrow impressions, deeper at the front, like whatever had made them had been putting weight forward as it moved. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edges. The dirt had been disturbed recently. I wasn't sure what kind of animal made tracks like that, but I wasn't going to let it ruin my trip. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The forest was beautiful, dense, and untouched. I followed a trail that eventually led to a small clearing with an old, rusted-out car sitting in the middle of it. The windows were smashed, the interior gutted. It looked like it had been there for decades. There was no road leading to it, no sign of a path big enough for a car to have gotten through. Just trees and silence. I didn't stay long. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the treeline. I started a fire, cooked dinner, and sat on the porch again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt different. The usual sounds were there, but it was like something was listening, just out of sight. watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had no reason to be afraid. That night, I woke again. This time, it was the door. The sound of it moving, the hinges groaning slightly. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart hammering. The door was still closed. I shined the light through the window, but the porch was empty. Just darkness and the outline of trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. Closer this time. They circled the cabin, stopping just before the porch steps. I followed them a little way into the woods before they disappeared into the underbrush. I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just an animal, something unfamiliar but harmless. But that night, it got worse. The noises were back. Scraping, thumping, something heavy shifting outside the walls. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Not loud, not hurried. Just a single knock, followed by silence. I sat up in my sleeping bag, gripping my knife, my breath coming fast. The fire was still burning low, casting everything in a dim orange glow. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Another knock. I stayed awake until the sun rose. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, there were no tracks. No sign that anything had been there at all. I packed my things. I didn't bother making breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the porch, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the cabin, shrinking in the distance as I put more and more road between me and whatever had been out there. I don't know what it was. Maybe just an animal. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But I never went back, and I never will. The plan was simple. A quiet weekend in the woods, away from the city, away from work, away from everything. The cabin was a rental, old but sturdy, sitting on the edge of a thick forest with no other houses in sight. It was late October, the air crisp and dry, and the trees had already shed most of their leaves. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant noise of life. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking below the treetops as I pulled up the gravel driveway. The cabin was exactly as it had looked in the pictures. Small, rustic, a wraparound porch with a few wooden chairs, and a stack of firewood neatly piled against the side. There was no service out here, which I expected. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to unplug completely. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main room with a couch and a fireplace, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Everything smelled like cedar and dust, like it hadn't been used in a while. I dropped my bag in the bedroom and started a fire in the wood stove. The temperature had already started to drop, and without central heating, I knew the fire would be my best friend. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking a few things, setting up a lantern on the kitchen counter. The owner had left a handwritten note on the table. "Welcome. Hope you enjoy your stay. Please don't leave food outside. Bears have been active. Wood is stocked by the shed. Lock up at night. Standard cabin warnings." I had no intention of feeding the wildlife, and I always locked up. By the time I had dinner, just a simple sandwich and some coffee, it was fully dark outside. The forest around the cabin felt vast, endless. No streetlights, no distant highway hum, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wood settling. Around 9, I stepped outside to get some firewood. The air was colder than I expected, my breath clouding in the light from the porch. The forest was a wall of blackness beyond the small circle of light from the cabin. I grabbed an armful of logs from the pile by the shed and turned back to the house. Then I stopped. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near the steps. Not mine. I hadn't walked there, and they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, slightly distorted in the soft ground, leading from the tree line toward the porch. I scanned the darkness, every nerve in my body on edge. There was no one, no sound, just the wind moving the trees. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe I'd missed them earlier. Maybe they were old. I walked inside, bolted the door behind me, and dropped the logs into the wood bin. I sat by the fire for a while, listening. Nothing, just the steady crackle of the flames. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia from being alone out here, but something felt off. I checked the doors and windows twice before heading to bed. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. No noise had woken me, just a feeling. The room was cold. The fire had died down, but that wasn't it. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that you don't have a name for, but your body knows before your brain does. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it, a faint creak from the floorboards outside the bedroom. I turned my head slowly toward the door. The cabin was dark, but I could see the sliver of light from the dying fire stretching across the floor. I stared at that sliver of light, unblinking, barely breathing. Then the shadow moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight just beyond the bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't move. The bedroom door was closed, but not locked. I didn't remember if I had locked the front door before going to bed. For what felt like an eternity, I just lay there, listening, staring at that thin line of light. The shadow didn't move again. No more creaks, no more sound, just silence. Then, finally, after what must have been an hour, I heard the softest sound. A slow, quiet breath, just on the other side of the door. I don't remember falling asleep. Maybe my body shut down from exhaustion. But when I opened my eyes, the bedroom was filled with the pale gray light of morning. I sat up, my whole body aching with tension. The cabin was silent. The fire had completely burned out. I listened for any sound. Nothing. Slowly, I climbed out of bed and moved to the door. My fingers hesitated on the knob before I turned it. The main room was exactly as I had left it. No signs of anything disturbed. No footprints. No open doors. But the front door was unlocked. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had I imagined everything? Felt real. Too real. I walked outside, my breath visible in the cold morning air. The ground was undisturbed. No new footprints, just the old ones leading from the trees. I didn't stay to find out more. I packed my things in minutes, grabbed my bag, and left. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked back once. The cabin stood there, quiet, still, just like it had the day before. But something about it felt different now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone last night. I drove straight back to town, stopping at a gas station to grab a coffee. The cashier gave me a nod as I paid. "Staying up at that old place?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yeah," he smirked. "Bet it was quiet up there." I forced a nod, took my coffee, and left. I haven't been back since. I remember that weekend like it was yesterday. It was early November, that strange time between fall and winter when the cold is sharp, but the first real snow hasn't settled in yet. I had rented a small, remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, looking for a quiet place to get away from work, from people, from everything. I had been stretched thin, and I thought isolation might clear my head. The cabin was simple. A single room with a wood stove, a small bed, a table, and a few shelves stocked with basic supplies. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well outside for drinking and an old outhouse a short walk into the trees. The only way in was a long, winding dirt road that I had driven for nearly an hour after losing cell service. No other cabins, no signs of people. Just me, the trees, and the cold. The first day was uneventful. I gathered firewood, set up my small propane stove for cooking, and settled in as the daylight faded. The silence was thick, the kind you don't notice in the city. No cars, no distant hum of electricity, just the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. I ate my dinner by lantern light and read for a while before finally crawling into bed, listening to the steady crackle of the fire in the stove. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a rhythmic creaking. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A slow, deliberate groaning like wood shifting under pressure. I lay there, barely breathing, trying to pinpoint it. The cabin had a small front porch with an old wooden rocking chair, the kind you see in every rustic vacation rental. It had been still when I arrived, wedged against the railing. But now, in the stillness of the night, something was making it move. I sat up slowly, listening. The creaking would start, go for a few seconds, then stop. Pause. Then it would start again, like something or someone was sitting in it, gently rocking. The fire had burned low, casting only faint orange light across the room. My rifle was in the corner, still in its case, but I didn't move for it yet. I just listened. Minutes passed. The chair stopped. Silence. I waited, my breath shallow, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, a coincidence, maybe just my mind playing tricks on me in the deep quiet. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back to sleep, convincing myself I had imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I stepped outside to get water from the well, and that's when I saw it. The chair had moved. It was now angled slightly away from where I had left it, as if someone had stood up and walked off. The ground around the porch was hard-packed dirt, but there were marks, subtle but there. The kind of disturbance that looked like something had stood in one place for a while. I didn't like that. I pushed the chair back against the railing, this time making sure one of the legs was wedged between two planks. If it moved again, I would know. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I chopped more firewood, took a short walk through the trees, and spent the afternoon reading by the stove. But as night fell, that uneasy feeling crept back in. I kept the fire going longer that night, sitting at the small table with my lantern, the rifle now leaning close by. Every so often, I would glance at the window facing the porch, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The air outside was still, no wind to blame this time. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Creak, creak, slow, deliberate, the same rhythm. I gripped the rifle, my palms sweating. My breathing slowed, my heart pounded. This wasn't the wind. The chair was moving. Creak, creak. I stood up, my legs feeling heavier than they should. The fire had burned low again, and the shadows in the room stretched long and deep. The chair continued its slow, deliberate movement. I took a step toward the window, careful, deliberate. The floorboards barely made a sound under my weight. I reached out and tilted the curtain just enough to see outside. Empty. The chair was moving, but no one was in it. I held my breath. Then, after a moment, it stopped. Dead still. The night was silent. I let go of the curtain and backed away from the window. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it the cold shifting the wood? Some unseen breeze? But the air was dead still. And why did it only happen at night? I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, watching the window, rifle in hand, waiting for something else. But nothing happened. The chair didn't move again. The night stretched on, painfully slow, until eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I stepped onto the porch that morning, every part of me on edge. The chair was in the exact same position I had seen it last. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground, the tree line, looking for anything, footprints, signs of animals, anything. But there was nothing. I made my decision quickly. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and left. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I didn't need answers. I just needed to be gone. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back one last time. The chair was still, motionless, but somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that something had been watching. And as I drove away, the woods stretched endlessly around me, quiet and undisturbed, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from any paved road. It wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of a friend, some guy I barely knew who had offered to let me stay there for a few days. I needed the break. Work had been brutal. My personal life was falling apart, and I just wanted to get away from everything. A cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the treetops. The road leading to the place was nothing more than a dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built from thick logs, a small porch out front, a single window looking out onto the clearing. No electricity, no running water. Just a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. It was exactly what I needed, quiet, simple, isolated. The first night was peaceful. I built a fire in the wood stove, heated up some canned food, and sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Felt good to be away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no people. The second day, I decided to explore. The woods stretched for miles in every direction, thick with pines and underbrush. I followed a narrow game trail, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. There were signs of wildlife everywhere. Deer tracks, the distant sound of something moving through the trees. At one point, I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed, weathered by time. It looked like no one had used it in years. I walked for hours, not really paying attention to where I was going. The sun was high when I finally turned back, retracing my steps, but something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I picked up my pace, pushing through the underbrush, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was starting to darken. I felt stupid for getting spooked. It was just the woods, just my imagination. I shook it off, made dinner, and settled in for the night. I woke up to a sound, not loud, but distinct. A soft thud, like something landing on the porch. I held my breath, listening. Then another sound, a slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on the wooden planks. I sat up, my mind racing. Could be an animal, a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. But something about the way the boards creaked didn't feel right. Felt human. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound came again, the soft scrape of something against the wood. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours before finally forcing myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. I spent the day close to the cabin, chopping wood, keeping busy. As the sun began to set, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept my hunting knife within reach. I wasn't scared, not exactly, just uneasy. That night, I heard it again. A thump, then another. Something was out there. I stayed still, gripping the knife, waiting. The creaking of the porch, slow and steady. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting. But eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They led from the trees to the porch, then back into the woods. My stomach turned. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been here, standing on my porch, watching. I packed my things. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I loaded up the truck and left without looking back. As I reached the main road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. Too far to make out any details. But I knew they were watching. I never went back, and I never found out who or what had been out there. I had been looking forward to a weekend alone in the cabin for months. It was a family place, tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or neighbors. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, but I needed the break. No work, no phone service, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive was long, winding through miles of dense forest on a road that barely looked maintained. The kind of place where if your car broke down, you'd be walking for hours. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place looked just how I remembered. Weathered wood, the porch slightly sagging, the windows dark and lifeless. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The furniture was still covered in sheets, the way my parents had left it. I took a quick walk through the rooms, checking everything. Kitchen was intact, the small bedrooms untouched. The only odd thing was the back door. It was unlocked. I figured I had just forgotten to lock it last time I visited. After unpacking, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace and cracked open a beer. The first night was peaceful. Just the sound of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I sat there for hours, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. When I finally turned in, I felt safe, like the woods had welcomed me back. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I laid there in the dark, listening. The fire had burned down, leaving only a faint glow in the fireplace. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the old windows. Then I heard it, a noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps on the porch. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps stopped just outside the door. I waited, counting the seconds. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or something. I finally forced myself to relax, telling myself it was nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The porch was empty, but something felt off. I glanced down at the dirt just beyond the steps. Footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. A chill crawled up my spine. Someone had been here. I spent the morning trying to shake the unease. I went down to the lake, chopped some firewood, tried to convince myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe they thought the cabin was abandoned. But that didn't explain why they had just stood there, watching. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows, and kept my rifle close. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls. I sat in the old chair, listening to the woods outside. Then, just like the night before, I heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch. I gripped the rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps stopped at the door. Silence stretched out, long and unbearable. Then a sound. Not knocking, not scratching, just the faintest pressure, like someone was leaning against the door, listening. I sat frozen, waiting. Then the footsteps moved again, slow and measured, circling around the cabin. I could hear them in the dry leaves, passing by the side window, then moving toward the back. The doorknob rattled. I stood, heart pounding. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door. I waited, breath held, muscles locked. Then, nothing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The fire burned lower. I didn't move until the first hints of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to check outside, my stomach twisted. The footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin, stopping at each window. The back door handle was smeared with dirt, like a hand had gripped it, trying to turn it. I didn't stay. I grabbed my bag, tossed it into the truck, and got the hell out. The whole drive back, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wonder if it was just some vagrant, someone looking for shelter. But then I think about the footprints, the way they circled the cabin, the way they just stood at the door, listening. And I know I was never supposed to be there. When I was in my early 20s, I spent a weekend alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods of Montana. It wasn't mine. I had rented it from a guy online who claimed it was the perfect escape from city life. I had been looking for solitude, a break from the noise and chaos of my daily routine. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air sounded perfect. The drive up took longer than I expected. The paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, winding higher into the mountains. My phone lost service about an hour before I even arrived. I wasn't worried about it at the time. In fact, I was looking forward to being completely disconnected. The cabin itself was small, just a simple wooden structure with a porch that overlooked the trees. It had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. There was no electricity, just a few old lanterns and a wood-burning stove. The guy who owned the cabin had left a stack of firewood and a few jugs of water by the door. The place smelled like cedar and dust, like no one had been there in a long time. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it hiking around the area, taking in the quiet. It felt good to be away from everything. When the sun started setting, I built a fire in the fireplace and made a simple dinner. The cabin creaked and groaned as the temperature dropped, but I figured it was just settling. Old wood expanding and contracting in the cold. I went to bed early that night. The bed was rough, the mattress thin, but I didn't mind. I listened to the wind through the trees and let the firelight flicker across the walls until I fell asleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was pitch black. I listened, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The woods were silent. No wind, no rustling, no animals. Just a deep, heavy stillness. Then I heard it. The faint sound, barely audible, like something moving outside. I held my breath, waiting. The sound came again. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The woods were full of them, but something about the way the sound had stopped so suddenly put me on edge. It was like whoever or whatever was out there had paused, listening just like I was. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I rolled over and pulled the blanket up higher. I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The second day passed without incident. I spent some time chopping wood, exploring a little further from the cabin, enjoying the quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The woods felt different now, heavier somehow, more watchful. That night, I double-checked the door before bed, making sure it was locked. I kept the fire going a little longer this time, letting the warmth keep the cabin comfortable. I fell asleep staring at the glow of the flames. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, there was no question about what had woken me. The sound was much closer now. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, pausing near the front porch. The old wood creaked slightly under the weight of something or someone. Standing there, I strained my ears, waiting. The footsteps didn't retreat. They just stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A lost hiker? Something worse? I reached slowly for the heavy flashlight I had left by the bed. When I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the cabin. I turned it toward the window, but all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. I wanted to check outside, but fear kept me rooted in place. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the flashlight on, listening to every tiny sound the cabin made. Eventually, the sky lightened and morning came. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The ground was damp from early morning dew. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of what I had heard. There were footprints, not animal tracks, not boots, bare footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the woods to my porch. They weren't mine. The prints circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the trees. The sight of them made my stomach turn. Someone had been out here, watching, listening, standing on my porch in the middle of the night. I packed up immediately, threw everything into my bag and locked up the cabin behind me. I didn't even stop to eat. I just got in my car and started driving. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on paved roads with cell service. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps and saw footprints? That I got scared and ran? No crime had been committed. Nothing had been taken. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. I never went back to that cabin.